Yes, thank you.
See, I still need this paper fast. This is a really long one. Yeah. So the idea here is I want to present my a project that I want to write for the FWO mandates with the deadline of 2nd of December. So the idea is to present like different building blocks. So I will talk about the pathologies I would like to present. I want to go a little bit more broader than MS, so I'll explain why, but still including MS. Talking about problem statements, specifically in the side of the task-oriented training, and then propose the concepts, the what, the why, and the how, where we want to solve these problems. So to start with pathologies, I want to start with the cerebellar, to include cerebellar ataxia. So the cerebellum is is a part of the brain. You see it there, and actually it's an area in the brain which is very difficult to image with the imaging methods that was before. So now, the last couple of years as well, a lot of because due to the advances in neuroimaging, the function of the cerebellum has started to really be on it, and it's actually a very interesting structure, and it really controls quite a lot of the things we do, in the sense that coordination, correction of movement, equilibrium, balance, and even more recently, even cognitive functioning. And this makes sense because of the position that it's in. It's connected to this structure, which is connected to also top brain and also the spinal cord, etc. So it's a really, quite a fascinating structure, let's say, that really controls a lot of movement. Now, what happens is if there is an assault to the cerebellum, and it could happen due to many reasons, either stroke or either demyelination. So it also happens with MS. Some people have symptoms with cerebellar ataxia or pure forms of it. One of the symptoms that they have is called cerebellar ataxia, and this is related directly to movement. And dysfunctions here affect gait, so affect walking, because there's inaccurate planning of movements. There is a big spatial variability, so this means that each step within the sequence is quite variable from the other. There is something called synergia, so this means that there's no coordination also within the multiple joints, and there's coordination effects. And in order just to quickly really put this into perspective, a very quick video to show this. This is what cerebellar ataxia looks like. Yeah, so it's really this is exaggerated. Well, it's not that exaggerated actually, because cerebellar ataxia is really wide range, no control within the joints, no timing, so it affects gait quite heavily. The next population that I would like to focus on is multiple sclerosis. So we already know it's a neurological impairment, degenerative demyelinating disease. It's multi-symptomatic, so the main cause is demyelination, and the idea is wherever you have the demyelination, there you have symptom. But what is more right now in focus in research is the subtypes. While here you see an axon on the axon itself. So you have the neuron and the axon, so the inflammation is here, and the medication targets here, and we have really good medications to maintain at least the inflammation here. So that's really positive. And now we have a lot of rehabilitation strategies, and one of the works we did in my PhD really targeted here, and we see really great improvements. But not in the inflammatory levels, of course, we haven't gone that way. But the problem with the progressive is that you have inflammation at the level of synapses. And what happens here is it already infiltrates the blood-brain barrier. And the problem is we don't have medication that we can actually send up there. And this is why progressive MS right now, there are experimental clinical trials with pharmacologically, but we are still really in need to develop rehabilitation programs and to develop um, ways to improve symptoms. And these symptoms are related to fatigue, fatigability, cognitive impairment, imbalance, and coordination. And we are looking here right now, relapsing, remitting. Sorry, it's a bit blurry, but you see that the inflammation is constant, but neuroaxonal loss is continued. So this means that these are the reasons why people have the symptoms that we talk about. So if we put these cerebellar patients and persons with MS who have progressive MS and cognitive impairment, there's quite we talk about three main functions that we want to target. We're talking about cognitive functions, motor functions, and fatigue. And this is where our problem statement comes. We don't have enough functional training. We don't have task-oriented training that would help these symptoms in these populations. And this is what we want to target. Well, the idea, this is the proposal. So how I would like to do this, the idea is to have an observational study in order to optimize the dosage dependent, individualizes functional training, and apply it in a clinical intervention using behavioral and neurophysiological measures. And how? Using the theoretical framework of auditory motor coupling. And well, regarding this, just to build up the construct again, is to use this theoretical framework. So what we already know from literature, what we have also provided in the PhD that we did, so to expand in our own contributions within these population, as well as why we want to emphasize using music in order to facilitate these auditory motor coupling, in order to actually optimize a therapy and then improve therapy. So this is the outline that I will use in order to try to guide you through the what, how, and why in the project. So first, let's start from literature and own contributions. So the main theoretical framework is based behind entrainment, and we're discussing this today as well. Of course, there are different viewpoints: a predictive viewpoint, a dynamic viewpoint. So these will be the main aspects that we're going to, well, I propose to use. When we have dynamical interactions, of course, occurring when walking is involved. What also facilitates, or let's say contributes to entrainment right now, is principles as temporal prediction, beat perception, the contribution of the motor contributions in these temporal predictions, and the neural networks of sensori-motor synchronization. So these would be the basis to use in order to let's say, manipulate sort of entrainment that we will provide. And of course, the stimuli itself, the length of the stimuli, the characteristic of the stimuli, the contributions also, how you say, are dependent also on the type of entraining that we do. So these could also be considered. Expanding from our results, we proposed that active cognitive components were involved during instructed entrainment. So when you're instructing someone to synchronize intentionally at the tempo of 4% of auditory stimuli. So these were a conceptual model that was proposed. We also noted that the cognitive the attending imposed some kind of a cognitive load. So this was at the charge of the cost of gait parameters. And we also went towards more meaningful gait metrics, going into gait dynamics using outcome measures in BFA. So this also gives a picture of the interaction. So having our results, which are also supported by literature. For example, in 2000, just a couple of months ago, another paper that showed that beat perception and instruction to synchronize also influence, for example, gait parameters. So here we come to the concept of cognitive load and the cognitive control of movement. So I think these are nice aspects to consider when we are building, let's say, this intervention that is using the concept of entrainment. So that's the idea, to use auditory motor coupling to try to develop a concept like this and then moving it into an intervention. So how do I propose to do this? Oh yeah, importantly, why music? before how I first use this. This was the question of Peter Yan. So, well, from literature, we know, of course, the reward, the agency aspect, music itself, we can actually give auditory perturbations only without sensory perturbations. Because, for example, in cerebellar patients, perturbating balance while measuring balance is also a bias of itself. It's a good stimuli to manipulate, and it's also continuous auditory structure, depending, of course, on the genre that we choose. From our study, we also have shown that music, compared to metronomes, music was less perceived when walking to music and synchronizing to it, which is important to note. It was less cognitive fatiguing, required less attention. Persons were able to synchronize longer. It's more motivating and resulted in more gait dynamics. So we have positive, let's say, attributes of why using music. So with this in mind, the observation study that I propose, and once again, this is really in progress, so please, like afterwards, feedbacks are welcome. So the idea is actually to have three different, from one experiment, three different research questions. One with passive listening, motor imagery, walking with auditory perturbations. And I will go through one by one right now, but the idea is that we want to check the effects of coupling when stepping with beat. So coupling, when I'm talking about this, well, walking, except for the first part, at different tempi. Now we add attention, gait dynamics, and perceived fatigue. And also, we want to investigate if the addition of walking, if the motor activity actually sharpens the sensory representations, which is quite a nice concept that has been introduced right now. So how do I propose that this could be done? So at the beginning, this is a baseline condition where persons would listen to different musical abstracts at different tempi. And then I added motor imagery in order to mimic synchronization. So motor imagery here means that the person imagines that they're walking. And there was, why I added this is there was actually one study, or two, one study that provided two papers, a grand scale study in MS, where they showed that motor imagery intervention with music actually was effective in persons with MS and fatigue. So the idea is motor imagery, it activates motor neurons, and by this, it kind of mimics the brain to activate as if it's activating while you're walking, but of course not as intensely. So the idea here is, because we want to see the research questions are to maybe my slides are maybe what you said back and forth. So because the research question is what's the effect of coupling during passive listening to music by the means of motor imagery on attention and perceived motor and cognitive fatigue, that is the reason why motor imagery is proposed here. So the outcome measures would be a measurement with the EEG and then perceived fatigue, cognitive and physical fatigue, and subjective questionnaire. Sorry, it's reversed. It was the only way to fit in the screen. So perceived motivation and perception of tempo. And the reason of perception of tempo is this is something we learned from the last experiment we did on the DFA, that we didn't have the perception of, is this higher, is this lower? The tempo might actually be a beneficial indicator when looking at what's happening with gait dynamics. Do they think they synchronized? Of course, this is important here. And the perception of perturbation is not relevant here. Sorry. And then next is, as I mentioned, the idea is what's the effect of the coupling during the listening to the different tempi. On attention, so measured within the EEG, I'll come back to it, motor and cognitive fatigue, and then are there associations with attention with subjective perceptions, and are there changes in healthy controls compared to different populations, as well as are there differences between the pathologies? So the hypothesis here is that active cognitive components will be reflected at a higher by the higher attentional demands observed in EEG. And we assume that this will be more pronounced after the 4%, let's say, as we conceptually theorized. Yeah. The next part then is the walking. So this time we do exactly the same, but instead of the motor imagery, they actually perform the task of walking. So since we have walking, we can also measure walking patterns. So here we also add measure of synchronization methods. So phase angle period matching and resultant vector length. We can also calculate longer range correlations and variability of walking, spatial temporal parameters of walking. And here, sorry, it's a lot of text, I know, but we're still going. The first question is, can also all participants couple? The cerebellar patients are new to us, so this is also a new question. Does attention then change across the tempi, and also is it different than motor imagery or not? So is it different than moving and non-moving? Is there a difference although there's motor imagery? And what is the effect of coupling on gait dynamics and perceived fatigue? And this is somewhere where I also want to come to Bart with Dieter afterwards. Does attention correlate to gait dynamics or where? Because actually the idea is to develop a biofeedback system based on this. But this will be more pronounced in the third stage. So the hypothesis generally as well that there will be a higher attentional demands observed in the EEG recording at the higher tempi. And there will be a pronounced difference compared to the motor imagery, etc. So next, the last part was walking, but right now taking auditory perturbations in questioning. And right now, when we talk to people, when we're doing the first experiment, they really like the tempi percentages. They really like this optimal tempi, the dosages. So I'm still trying to find a way to optimize dosage. So what is the perfect pill to give the person? Minus the pill because we're into rehab, right? So, and I thought, why are we going always optimal? Because it's sometimes nice to go suboptimal and super optimal. So the idea here is to, at the walking part, to see what is the condition that participants had an optimal, and this is a question mark, how do we define it? Last time we defined it as a condition that they synchronized more and had to maintain stride length. And to take these 3 tempi only, so per participant, and then participants would walk with these 3 tempis, once without any auditory perturbations and once with auditory perturbations. And what I mean by perturbations is that we will add deviations within the auditory structure at these tempi. And the idea is also to check for, the idea here is to check what happens to attention over time. So when there are no perturbations and then when there are perturbations. And hopefully over time, the cognitive load of a person, especially at higher tempi, decreases. So the attentional demands would decrease over time. So this is what we want to see. And this would be really nicely then these attentional demands correlated to the gait dynamics, and optimally these gait dynamics is what we would use in the biofeedback system. So yes, so basically what I said in research questions. Yeah. Can I skip these? So the EEG protocol. So when I mentioned that the EEG protocol that will be used, I must say it's very vague because I still have to really dig into these EEG protocols to see what I can do. When I talked to some colleagues also who has been using EEG in Hasselt, they mentioned if you would like to correlate it with, for example, gait dynamics, if not on an average base, perhaps using time frequency domain could be helpful. And by doing this, I also looked online at papers that there was a feasibility of doing time frequency analysis domain EEG with long measures. So some articles used studies on driving simulation of 90 minutes, and they looked at sustained attention, for example. And the lower this paper here, they looked at, actually this was they made people watch TV series, and then they looked at their memory and attention, and these series lasted for 30 minutes each. So basically then they looked at 3 different frequency bands, time series domains, and this is what they did. So my idea was that it will be feasible to look into EEG using time frequency domains, but I have to go more into deeper on how we are going to be able to do this.
So look at the frequencies, not at the ERP.
Yes, frequencies, yeah, over time. Yeah, but when your gait is stopped today, I also thought that ERPs could be feasible here because we have the beats over time, and then we can also average them out. But so we can have 2 different metrics, but preferably if you want to correlate them to gait dynamics, like on DFA, perhaps then the time frequency is best. And then, yeah, looking at the time series analysis, looking at the DFA on interstep intervals, for example, the idea is to map the activity of attention of the different tempi to the gait dynamics, then use these gait dynamics as a biomarker with each other. Now, Bart, I'm looking at you. This is feasible or not? So that's the concept. Because from here, I'm going to, well, from there I will come back because the idea is here, of course, we're going to use music. We don't compare it to metronomes. Is this smart or not? Here, at each tempi, we will give 4 minutes. And also music selection is something that we have to think about. I don't think we can individualize it as much as we did last time. And in the last time, with perturbations, 15 minutes without perturbations, looking at the 3 different stimuli and defining, we still have to define the perturbations. That's the variation that we want to put in the stimuli, so that it's not predictable per se. And finally, we go into the application in a clinical intervention. So we have 3 different populations. So the idea is why also the 3 different is because we can, if we have answers for these populations, perhaps we can generalize them to other populations having the same symptoms. And this is quite valuable to the field. So of course, the observational analysis has to build this part. So having a functional auditory motor coupling training using gait dynamics as attention as biomarker, instead of the traditional cadence, the one that we use right now, compared to usual care or more perfectly is sham biofeedback situation, which we have to think of how to do still. So the research questions is functional auditory motor coupling using the gait dynamics intentional compared to the other methods, intervention methods, or other controls, superior to improve balance, coordination, cognition, and fatigue in all pathologies compared to the healthy controls. So we hypothesize that this is done because this action perception coupling actually trains adaptability and flexibility. And this is what we want to train. This is where it becomes a bit novel.
Question, can you think of gait dynamics as a biomarker, or is it just a mechanical description?
I was suggesting it as a biomarker. And by gait dynamics, maybe the term right now is too broad, but we mean the biomarker of alpha, for example, that we used, to use it as a biomarker in the system. But feedback is welcome if you don't agree. Yeah. So outcome measures, so the idea is to have an 8 or 12-week intervention with a pre and post examination with a 1-month follow-up. So this means that they do the intervention, and then after the post-testing, they do nothing, and then we measure them again 1 month to see if these functions are retained. So to measure synchronization abilities, gait dynamics and gait motor, cognitive, dual subjective, and questionnaires. During the training, we can also collect data on synchronization parameters, the gait dynamics and subjective fatigue. And finally, but I don't think it should be added to the FWO because it's not realistic in the application framework, I would definitely like to add a neuroimaging component to it in the sense of an MRI or fMRI to look into the correlates of sensori-motor synchronization and temporal processing, and if possible, objective fatigue, so oxygen consumption, because we see that fatigue is less subjectively, but can we also show that objectively? So there's also some questions about the content of the intervention, double-blinded study. So are the assessors and the intervention givers, so they're blinded to which arm the subjects are in 8 or 12 weeks. This depends on how long the participants are in the hospitals. The content is important, individualized progression, the session per week, time per session. So these are things that we have to standardize, and we can perhaps control it with exercise therapies that are already existing. But other important markers are how to power the study and primary outcome measures, because there are none to start with. Equipment needed per session for assessment and the training, are they the same or different? And tracking of activity level at home, which becomes important. And finally, it's multiple pathologies, so we have to really be careful with inclusion criteria. Do we choose them per pathology, or still that's not clear to me? And also we need where to recruit them from. Thank you. So I can imagine that that was a little bit fast and not clear, so please, sorry for that. Questions and comments are welcome.
Yeah.
Yes.
Why do you need EEG?
The idea there is to really look into attentional components, because we saw that at a certain tempi, 4%, for example, was high. And we said this is because the motor threshold was quite high, and most probably the cognitive threshold too, so cognitive load. We only proved this behaviorally. And the idea to move into EEG is to prove this with including neuroscience, that yes, there's an attentional increase here. One part is.
But doesn't it depend on what the attention, where the attention is directed to, and can you really see that in your EEG?
Yeah, that's the question that we want to do. So in these papers that I saw, there was the sustained attention, which I think is something that also has to do with the coupling, can be measured over time, and then the idea is to also compare the sustained attention across the tempi. So the overall attention as well. So to see perhaps a sustained attention at 2% is not the same as 6%. So that was quite the idea. And also to try to correlate this to behavioral measures in order to, because we also noticed that when we asked persons to walk, cadence was improved, but stride length and speed wasn't. So we said, okay, if we really want to work on behavioral measures, is it the best way to just increase cadence, for example, which is at 6%, yes, but perhaps with gait dynamics, we have a better idea. It could be more correlated to balance and fear of falling. And I thought
but can't you measure that better directly with measurements of the movements? I mean, with all sensors.
Yeah, but
I mean, then you get a feeling of the dynamics in which, how many dimensions it is necessary to control.
We would like to add, I mean, the behavioral is there.
It's easier, I guess, than trying to find something in the EEG. And plus that you have problems when walking and measuring the EEG. This not done.
It's not done yet.
Yes.
And that's a novelty as well for this.
But I could imagine that you put at least sensors, gyroscope, etc., and see what really happens with the limbs, etc. And then you know also attention, I guess.
But that's a distinction between mechanical description and biomarkers, and they have not to be opposed to each other, they can complement each other. But the problem is to implement it, if you have to do the walking and all this kind of...
Yes. From feasibility point of view, I know it's going to be difficult finding the biomarkers, but I think with the right expertise, we would get there, because we have the sensor technology, and but the idea is, finding the biomarker, of course, in with attention, specifically with attention.
Do you have an idea of all possible biomarkers of attention?
No, not yet.
For instance, also EMG,
Oh,
attention,
that's
or other markers, perhaps heart rate, all kinds of functions of the body.
Honestly, I haven't looked into the heart rate or
perhaps
hypertension.
You can do more than just EEG.
Yeah. Because in MS, for example, we know that the heart rate is very variable, and therefore comparisons across participants with the heart rate is quite dangerous to do, because you don't really know if the variability of the heart rate is due to, let's say, a problem or just the status that way. We also thought about FNIRS, because right now a lot of people are using FNIRS to look into the load of walking. But I also understood that the FNIRS was not advantages in terms of temporal resolution. And if we would like to have that with the correlations, that's why I went to the EEG actually.
It's such a challenge to combine continuous measurement between biomarkers with enough temporal and spatial resolution.
Yeah. I think if you present such a project, that you should convince the reviewers that it is feasible, and then they will ask questions like the one Leon answered. Why EEG? Because you have already quite a big apparatus, etc., etc. But so I was wondering, if you want to do EEG, first of all, is the latest finding in your research related, which relates to attention and the walking pattern, whether there is an adaptation to local prediction errors, or let's say whether they can follow more long-term correlations in the patterns, whether that could not be investigated by EEG, for example, by studying upstream and downstream activations in different wave bands. But that's already, I think, a postdoc on its own, just to focus on that little aspect. And so I'm also wondering if you should not think about a little bit.
It's too ambitious.
Yeah. Let's say pruning a little bit in what you have and focusing on particular things that you can elaborate a little bit more.
So, for example, going more into the perturbations, like the imagery is quite in the perturbations without the EEG, going into more what's happening with the predictive system, and then moving into an intervention.
Well, I don't do any I have any preference for the moment, but yeah, just.
So right now, as I presented, it's too much and then not feasible in the way.
It's a bit like your title.
Yeah, I could say shorter title needed.
Yeah, for sure, because in my feedback for FWO, they also mentioned lack of synthesis ability, and you can see it in the title. So my title was too big, so they really look at that as well.
Yeah, because actually, I placed the EEG because I really do think it's an interesting aspect to look into. That could be done without, let's say minus the application. But with that, I'm a bit scared for them to say this is quite similar than your PhD project within the intervention part, which is not because we're.
But the question is, if you use EEG, would it still be needed to do a big intervention study? Because those are the two things that are very heavy. In terms of research, I think.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
If I can add on the EEG part, maybe, because you said that you're interested in different pathologies then, but if you say for MS, a big problem is the lack of, or the disruption of the myelinization of the axons. I think then it's very interesting to look at neural activity, because that's how the communication can be transported from one axon to the other. But I think if you are really set on going that direction, perhaps it might be interesting to talk to people from the neurology department that we have contact with. They are mostly, when we did our course, very much into epilepsy research. So, but maybe they can also have insight into other pathologies, and it could be interesting to talk to them how you can implement that specific part of the MS to your own project. But I don't know how that relates to the other pathologies that you mentioned then.
Yeah.
For me, it was also not clear whether this was a diagnostic tool or a therapeutic one. And that's, it's nice to show that this can be applied, but
you need to diagnose to do the intervention. So it's chronologically.
But it's not a diagnosis in the sense to diagnose an impairment or something like that. It's a diagnosis to individualize the dosage. To give to the participant that right now, this is where your cognitive load is still okay, And this is where you're still going to work at it and you're going to improve it in a way.
Mhm.
So maybe dosage-dependent diagnostics towards an intervention.
So I think you should focus on that aspect.
This is the main word, to focus, to have a focused title and focus design. It's not easy, you know, it's very difficult. But I'm very impressed by this search for biomarkers and also how should you define the cognitive load, how can you measure this? There is a lot of work about MS, but there is not much work about cognitive loading. And then if you can challenge this cognitive load, then you can make your interventions more effective. So I would like to see you work on the biomarkers, but you have to define them very strictly, and not just EEG. There is more than EEG, and especially the continuous measurement. This is important with a high temporal resolution. And for this EEG is important. It's on the millisecond level, but perhaps you have to do some literature search before.
Why do you try to include two pathological conditions? I find it a bit odd because when you show the movie, the walking was really very irregular, very disturbed, and then you want to add stimuli and add perturbations to the stimuli. So I'm not really sure what's really the point of trying to combine the both. I think they're both separate experiments, but it might be a different way to look at things.
I completely agree, but that's also a strategic point of view, because in an FWO application, you can't focus on one pathology, but this is told by different members. You need to go broad and also select pathologies that you can see they will be applicable to the general broad population. So just focusing on MS is not going to work, and I personally have I wanted to actually start with cerebral disease at the beginning with MS, because there's cerebral ataxia in MS. So the idea could be is we can still use MS and really go progressive, because that's really relevant right now, progressive MS. Cognitive impairment, so we have also the lines here. And then the cerebellar with the balance and coordination, which also the other MS have. And in this population, it's really relevant because we don't have rehabilitation. The rehabilitation consists of putting two lines and going forward. And there are some models when you look at sensori-motor synchronization. So from the cerebellar thalamocortical pathways with the basal thalamic cortical pathways, I really do think that this synchronization would help these population with their timing and pre-planning. So I really do think that maybe not in a one instant, like how we did it in an observational study, we're not going to see any effects, but over an intervention, I really do believe that we will see effects using the concepts of sensory-motor synchronization, predictability, adaptation, and flexibility.
But I think then the idea that you presented was really overly complex to accomplish that. So it would more resemble the first study that you did instead of the one that you presented. So it kind of feels like adding a second population just for the project proposal, to say.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because yes, the goal was to focus on the biomarker, but perhaps we have to really double check the EEG and to link it to the gait dynamics, and then to use this within the intervention. So the idea was still in that first package to still contribute to the frameworks of entrainment as we did, and to still individualize. But maybe that didn't come through, as you mentioned.
But can't you just focus on the gait dynamics and try to understand when predicting from the status of the person and maybe some things that he has to accomplish to see whether you can predict where he will have difficulties. Just focusing on that and do really dynamics of the whole system.
So you're predicting the symptoms, you mean?
Yeah, the predicting where he is going to stop or what he's going to do, just from following him, the gait dynamics, and try to predict kind of Kalman filtering where he has problems to put his static foot or something like that. I think it is already a lot of work to try to find it, just from the dynamics of the things you measure and try to predict. And you can then also put problems, right? That he has to make a little step up, and you see that the Parkinson's people, they have to predict or to go through a narrow, and then they get this freezing and so on, that you really try to understand how he maneuvers the patient. I don't think that this is very complex to try to look in his head. But,
Yeah.
but that's my idea. That you can.
Yes. No, I completely I see that point of view. Maybe I'm also pushing for this intervention because I also would like to.
But then you also know better what are the problems, and then you can really train on that.
Yes, but there are, for example, we know that there are balance problems, we know that there are coordination problems, but, well, at least with the cerebellar pathology, we don't know yet much about synchronizing the stimuli. That's for sure. And what happens, where can they predict to, how can they actually use this corrective mechanism as well? Because, well, the structure is damaged, so you really don't know. But Sonia Kotz works quite a lot with cerebellar pathologies, and she proves that there's sparing of these pathways. So that's why I was encouraged also to use them as a pathology for an intervention. But of course, it's very risky because we don't know how they would react. We also don't know how how slow the musical stimuli. We cannot use 90 or 100 beats per minute to start with. I think we have to, and most probably it's asymmetrical too. So these will be challenges.
Is it known that these people get advantage of listening to music, like we know from the Parkinson people?
Very, very briefly. The evidence is not, actually, as far as I know, there has not been an intervention using music or auditory cues. There only has been implications that they are spared in order to still process some time.
Mm-hmm.
Compared with your PhD, so you now expand, let's say, the population. You use EEG. It was just a behavioral study. You do an intervention study, and you do this disturbance perturbation. So these are 4 new things, actually.
Yeah.
That's already quite complex.
So maybe if I would keep it for the cognitive load, the perturbations are interesting. Yeah, and then the population perhaps with the intervention.
Well, you have to keep the intervention study.
I don't have to.
No,
it's a personal.
It's in Med supply.
It's Med 8, yeah. Yes, because yeah, that was also the ambition in the PhD, but yeah.
Just a thought, but now you include MS because of your experience, but you might consider simplifying the experiment and leaning more on the aspects that we already had with MS and try to see if you can apply it to different populations. Because there were a few basic questions. Does the stimuli actually work with these kind of pathologies? So that's a very basic question. If it hasn't been answered yet, I think it's a very interesting thing to see if
generalizability.
Exactly. Can music, this type of music, the thing we found in the MS study, can it be applied to, for example, the Parkinson, which we have a lot of background knowledge of, and also the other pathologies. So it might be interesting to look even more broader and not deeper, to say, in the experiment.
But also retention is also an interesting question.
Yeah.
But then again, the intervention study aspect still remains because you can test it out and see if it remains also. So, well, it's just an idea.
Another possibility maybe for EEG is to limit the number of people that you investigate. So you have fewer people, but you can,
So pilots actually, and not in the
well,
FWO, but
not
personal.
necessarily pilots, but go really into depth in a small number of cases. Instead of having a lot, practically it's...
No, practically, when I was trying to think about the timeline, I was thinking 6 years. So I also didn't know if for the postdoc I should really focus on 3 years or not, and I cannot write, for the 6 years. So
What you propose is more kind of a European project. How many partners?
yes, but I think it's really, the imagery, I think it's so valid because we have a lot of patients in wheelchair that the imagery, for example, could really be spot on, but we can only investigate that if we do that. But perhaps it's not my application.
Yeah, for the reviewers, if they see it, it's too much, and it's sometimes done, but
That'll be a problem.
Yeah. So I think I will take the advice, try to maybe focus more on the
The
intervention.
EEG is interesting, especially in combination with walking. I think it has not so often been done.
Actually,
But there is some literature, right?
Probably there is some literature.
Which is good because there is, but then with these populations, I would say no.
especially EEG with audio.
Yes, EEG and audio and
I don't think
video
there's-
and
Well, what we write in the application and what is done in person, I think we can always add the EEG, I guess, but the application has to still have that novel aspect that would be granted, let's say.
Adding EEG is not really just putting on a cap and adding
No,
a
no, no.
computer. It's,
Yeah, with expertise.
yeah, also for the patients, it's quite, still a bit more invasive than putting on an iPhone on your ankle.
And also the problem is that you don't have any clue of what to extract from the EEG.
No, not
So,
Also, the frequency bands.
yeah.
I guess we get some more experience in the coming months on that, of course.
But yeah, I think actually, if you study, I can send you literature on the EEG and gait, because I was thinking of doing something with the juggling, so I did some research past months. I can send that there is material, and also actually for the cognitive load, there is. I'm thinking of relating it to tapping now.
But you are going to ARS.
Yeah.
Can discuss also with
Yeah, but for example, this frontal alpha suppression is quite strong as a biomarker. It looks quite valid as a biomarker of cognitive, allocation of attentive resources towards something. No? Can be for decoupling and intentionally coupled to something else. For example, relating to your case and the speed of the metronome or the music or the stimuli, let's say, they found that increasing the tempi for the tapping correlates to measure frontal alpha suppression. So like there they assume that the cognitive load comes from the reference being too fast, so requiring more effort for the subject.
That's what we
We have the frequency bands, but also the location.
Yeah, also location.
It's
Yeah,
spatial,
yeah,
it's two dimensional.
yeah, but it's something quite broad. I mean, as long as it's frontal region approximately, it's quite consistent as a mark. And also what you said before, actually, I think that we discussed this with Valerio yesterday about what's the role of movement. Then I would keep it as mechanical descriptor at this point, because I think the advantage there is that you gain in adapting your feedback, you gain all the time from the brain response to the gait. And also I would say that the system can be much more better adaptive in time if you base it on if you have a solid biomarker. But no,
I would find it very interesting if it could be coupled to this idea of adaptation gain of the way in which the prediction error actually adapts your timing hypothesis.
And which is measurable also.
Whether that will be measurable by EEG, looking at upstream and downstream, let's say, activities. So the upstream would be more the data-driven markers, biomarkers, and the downstream would be more the theory-driven markers, like P300 with respect to more the upstream.
So it's the
This is
spatial.
ours, eh?
But that's,
all these markers.
that's more ERP driven, but you see it in the
Yeah, they work a lot with ERP,
And mismatch negativity and so forth.
Yeah. Which is not the best approach in this case, but
so, but the problem of the proposal is that I think you should have at least an idea of what you will be looking at if you say I'm going to use EEG just in the wild.
And what you will find also.
Yeah,
This is,
yeah.
Because you see some guarantee for
Some
results.
hypothesis,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, but not too much as well.
Yes, I was thinking about your.
Yeah, indeed, I had the feedback that, so I want to look at and investigate the biomarkers as stated, and then they say, and then I summed them up, I'm going to look at this, this, and this, and then they said, yeah, it looks like you already know all the biomarkers. So, done, was their conclusion. So, yeah, it's really dependent on who are the reviewers and
They also made the comment that there was not enough EEG experience.
yeah,
And some other made the comment, so it's.
theory state where you will get the experience.
I was thinking of pitching, if we would include this EEG, pitching it to Sonia Kotz and asking her, I don't know if you feel like, I think with her cerebellar work and working EEG,
And Hasselt, is there?
Maastricht.
there is some colleagues,
But
Yeah.
currently at Peter is.
in Peter we don't have, but we have Kim Van Doen, she worked with cerebellar and EEGs before, and now she's doing some stimulation of the cerebellum as well. She's the one who advised me to go into more frequency, time frequency analysis of EEG.
But this cerebellar stuff it's quite emerging and new. So
Yeah.
I think this can
It's-
be interesting.
And I think it's key to understand
Yeah,
the
it's a
movement.
hot topic.
I think Sonia Kopp is
Yeah, it's very famous.
Yes, indeed.
She was one of my viewers, one of our viewers.
So I was thinking of, perhaps because also in that observational study I had all the sessions with EEG. Perhaps that's also an overkill.
Okay. So,
Thank
thank you.
Ja, en ik hoop het.